Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Please come on in. Make yourselves at home. I read an article recently. It was an article about untreated wood.
Well, welcome everybody.
And the article said that untreated wood, if left outdoors in a harsh environment,
please come on in. Make
like
yourselves at home.
Could be expected to last, and I'm quoting,
I read an article
anywhere
recently.
from 2 months to several years.
About untreated wood. Well, welcome.
It made me
the
think,
article said that untreated wood,
what would be the odds
outdoors
that a structure made of untreated wood,
make yourselves at home, could be expected to last
in Florida,
I read an article
might still be standing today
to several years
if it had been built before the name Abraham Lincoln was known to Americans, or the name Gettysburg for that matter,
that a structure made
or
of untreated
the Statue of Liberty, Pearl Harbor.
Could be expected
You
to
get the
last
idea.
in
But such a church exists. It's St. Mark's in
in
Palatka, made entirely of untreated wood, and it's been there since 1855. It has been modified a little bit, but most of the wood is still the original wood.
You get the idea.
And it's going strong. It's now in its third century.
In Palatka,
And just to give a little perspective to that, when St. Mark's in Palatka was built in 1855, the total population of Florida was smaller than the number of people that you could fit into one NFL stadium today. And that would be the AT&T Stadium that is home to the Dallas Cowboys. It's true that that stadium only seats 80,000 normally, but it can be reconfigured to seat 100,000. And that's greater than the population of Florida was in 1855. And to give a little more perspective, when St. Mark's in Palatka was built, again entirely of untreated wood, in 1855, the Third Seminole War was still being fought. In fact, the entire town of Palatka had been burned down by the Seminoles only 20 years earlier. This is a book on Florida's Carpenter Gothic churches that Phil Eschbach, who is here with me in the front row, and I have been working on for, well, I'm too embarrassed to say how long, but a long time, many, many years. And it's going to be published in about 12 days. Yes, 12 days or so. And we're excited about that. I'll mention a few things about it, and then we'll get into the program. The book, as you can see, is titled Spires in the Sun, the Carpenter Gothic Episcopal Churches of Florida. We intend for it to be the definitive account of how this architectural style was developed in Florida. It does profile 39 churches individually. There is an early manuscript copy up above, and you can look at that on your way out if you're interested. Some of you have seen it on the way in. The book in final form will be 592 pages. It is 8.5 by 11. There is text and photography on every page. It will be hardbound with a dust jacket. It will have Smythe sewn binding, which means that when you open it, it lies flat no matter where you open it. The production values of the book are quite high. We're very pleased that it was recently reviewed very nicely in the Central Florida Episcopalian. I would offer the suggestion that it might make a good Christmas present for an Episcopalian or a Floridian or just a lover of old churches. It is possible to pre-order it for the lowest price that's available anywhere from the ladies who are grouped at a table just above. That's the plug for the book. Actually, Phil and I have no financial stake in the book at all. It's the publisher who will rise or fall on the strength of the sales of the book. Our topic today is, of course, Florida's Carpenter Gothic Episcopal Churches. We're going to answer 3 questions. What is a Carpenter Gothic church? The second question that we'll answer is, how did this particular architectural form come into being, and how did it get to Florida? And the third question is, what do these churches look like in Florida? I know that some of you, probably all of you, have seen at least one or two. We're going to take you on a visual journey and see a few more. So first, what is a Carpenter Gothic church? I could go through a very dry academic description or definition, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to look at an archetypal Carpenter Gothic church. This sketch is from Richard Upjohn's Rural Architecture, which was published in 1852. It had a profound influence on church building. It's a book of plans and specs, as I say, and the sketch of a church is the sketch that you're looking at. Now, the first thing that we'll do in looking at this is point out that it's made entirely of wood, all of it. You can't have Carpenter Gothic without the carpenter, right? So it's entirely made of wood. Now, in Florida, the roofs, too, are made of wood. They were everywhere. In Florida, I want to point out that the roofs were made of either cypress shingles or southern red cedar shingles. They were not metal roofs originally. A lot of people in Florida, including parishioners at some of these churches, think that their metal roofs were original because they're so old. They were not. They were all originally of wood. The second thing that I'll point out is the board and batten siding. That's highly characteristic of this architectural genre. The third thing I'll mention is that these churches are very small, and I mean small. They are from 50 to 70 feet long, and they, to give you an idea just how small that is, one of the Amtrak cars, one of the Amtrak train cars passing here in Winter Park is 85 feet long. So all of these churches are shorter than an Amtrak passenger car. They seat about the same number of people, too. These churches seat anywhere from 60 to 90 people, whereas the Amtrak car will seat 72. Now, when I say they're small, let me give you an example. The original Grace Church in Ocala, one of these churches, was 36 feet long and 18 feet wide. It's been expanded since then. But again, to put that in some kind of real-life perspective, that means it was 6 feet longer than half of a bowling alley, and it was as wide as 3 queen-size mattresses laid end to end. When I say they're small, they were very small. Many of them have been expanded. The next thing is that this church, even for its small size, is tall, it's slender, and it's pointed. It's very pointed. Everything about it, including the steeply pitched roofs, points to the sky. It's intended to draw the eye, and it's hoped the mind, heavenward. That's the reason for the verticality in the orientation. It has a long nave, that's the central portion of the building. It has a deep chancel. The chancel is fully a third of the overall length of the structure. There's often a tower, as there is here. The tower is often asymmetrically placed, as opposed to being centrally placed. And the interior always has exposed ceilings. And you always see on the interior scissor trusses when you look up. And we'll see that in a moment. Now, let's talk about the windows for a minute. The windows are called lancets. They are narrow and high, and they come to a top that is either a classic curved Gothic arch, as these are, or in Florida, they come to a straight-edged point. And I'm going to illustrate both of those for you. Here, we're now getting into Phil Eschbach's photographs. Of course, the cover of our book was too. But here you can see at the top, you can see at the top that we've got the curved type of classic Gothic arch. You see the difference? Here we've got the straight-edged type. The straight edge was easier for a frontier carpenter to miter, as you can imagine. So that's the reason for that top. Now let's talk about the glass that's in the windows. This type of glass, of course, is stained glass, but it's called quarry type. It is a lattice work of lozenge-shaped panes called quarries, from the French word carré because of their essentially square shape. And in the center, you can see that they have stenciled black foliate or geometric patterns. That is called grisaille, a French word. So that's the quarry type of window. The next type of window is a more expensive, a more resplendent type, and it is this type. These are figurative windows. These require more artisanship, they take longer to build, and they are more expensive. And a typical progression at these churches is that the quarry type would be installed first because it was less expensive, and the mission or parish could recover its financial breath. And then typically these figurative windows, or permanent windows as they were sometimes called, would be installed to replace the quarry windows over time. Typically these windows would be donated by families as memorials to loved ones. You can see this one's inscribed at the bottom for that purpose, and most of them are. Now, the last thing that I'll share with you is All Saints in Enterprise on the north side of Lake Monroe. And I'm sharing this just because it shows the color scheme. Today, a typical color scheme for these churches is white with the trim in another color, here dark green or hunter green. But that's not the way the churches were done originally. Originally, they were an earthen color, like brown or gray. And the trim, if different, was in white. So they have changed in that regard over the years. Another thing that I'll point out is that all the Florida churches are elevated for obvious reasons, to get them off our damp soils and the access to termites and all that. Whereas the Upjohn drawing that we saw was on the ground. In the Northeast, you could get away with that, but not in Florida. Well, let's talk for a moment about where this style came from. That's our second question, remember? These churches are the American expression of Gothic revival principles in wood. They are the American expression of Gothic revival principles in wood. The Gothic revival began in England in the mid-1800s when stone Gothic churches, and other buildings too, were designed by Augustus Pugin and other architects during the English Gothic revival. Pugin, sometimes called God's architect, designed the ornate and opulent interiors of Parliament. You'll recall that the original Palace of Westminster burned entirely, was replaced by what we know as Parliament in the mid-1800s. And Augustus Pugin designed all of the extremely ornate interiors. He also designed Big Ben. It is not an exaggeration to say that Pugin changed the face of Britain with his work, and he was highly influential. Now, the churches designed by the English Gothic Revival architects were based on forms that had originally hundreds. Those forms, of course, are found in the medieval Gothic churches and cathedrals of England and France. The English Gothic revival quickly spread to America, where it was applied to stone and brick churches, particularly those of the Episcopal Church in urban areas. But in America, the principles were also translated to wood, especially on the frontier and in rural areas. On the frontier, wood was abundant. It was plentiful, it was light, it was easy to carry, and relatively quick to work with. Whereas stone and brick were obviously much heavier, harder to come by, harder to transport, and took longer to work with. So that's where the style came from. It came from the Middle Ages to the English Gothic revival to America, and there it was simplified, miniaturized, and transmuted to wood. For that reason, given the origins of our Carpenter Gothic churches, it's no stretch to think of them as tiny, simplified, wooden descendants of the great Gothic churches and cathedrals of the Middle Ages. They are, in effect, wooden nano-cathedrals. That's their bloodline. That's their DNA. Now, there are three things I'll mention quickly. This style of architecture is found only in America and to a small extent in Canada. Yes, there are wooden churches elsewhere in the world, but not of this type. The second thing is that this is not the only or even the first use of wood in America for churches. You have the New England meeting houses, the colonial meeting houses, after all, and you had churches built in wood in the Greek Revival style, for example. So those preceded this. And the third thing I want to mention is that the Carpenter Gothic style is strongly associated with the Episcopal Church because its earliest, its most numerous, and its purest expressions were created by the Episcopal Church. Now that leaves the question, how did this style get to Florida? The complete answer is that it was brought here by a wave of travelers and settlers in the 1800s, and they consisted of Anglican clergymen, architects, builders, and lay people who were influenced by the Oxford movement, the Gothic revival, and ecclesiology. Ecclesiology at that time meaning the study of medieval church architecture. But if historians had to give one person primary responsibility for bringing the style to Florida, without hesitation and unanimously, they would select this man. This is John Freeman Young, who eventually became, at about the time this picture was taken, the second Episcopal bishop of Florida. But when he was young, which is where we're going to start, from 1845 to 1860, fresh out of seminary in his 20s and 30s, he was stationed in succession to Florida, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. In Florida, he came in 1845, straight out of seminary. He wasn't even a full priest yet. At that time, the Diocese of Florida consisted of one state. It was the entire state, one diocese, one state. Florida had just been made a state, and the diocese in Florida, this is the Episcopal Diocese of Florida, had grown to, anybody want to guess how many churches there were in Florida at that time? And mind you, it had grown to get there. 9. There were 9 Episcopal churches in Florida when John Freeman Young came here. Of those, only 2 were self-supporting. Only 2 could support themselves. He was stationed to Jacksonville, which then was a very small, scruffy, remote port town, and he helped the parish there, St. John's, complete their construction of a small semi-Gothic wooden church on the top of Billy Goat Hill, it was called, in Jacksonville. Now, after his time on the frontier, John Freeman Young, at 1860, then 40 years old, his abilities recognized by the National Church, was appointed to the prestigious position of assistant rector at the famous Trinity Church in New York City at Broadway and Wall Street. There, he did many things, but he became an authority on liturgics and church music. And he lectured on those subjects. He traveled to lecture on those subjects at the University of the South at Sewanee. He also published a book of ancient hymns that he translated. It was titled Great Hymns of the Church. And here is a page from that hymnal. One of the hymns that he translated, these were older hymns, but one that he translated was a slightly jaunty Austrian tune called Stille Nacht. Translated by Young, and slowed down to a lullaby, it became Silent Night, which is the most popular Christmas carol in the English-speaking world. It is Young's lyrics that we will be singing a little over a month from now. Now, while at Trinity, Young also got to know and work with Richard Upjohn, the renowned Richard Upjohn, famous American Gothic revival architect. And they worked together on at least one project, and probably on many. Now, there are three things I want to say about Richard Upjohn. I'll show you a picture of him. He was the designer of Trinity Church on Broadway and Wall Street. He was the founder of the American Institute of Architects and the first president of that institute. And he is also the author of this pattern book and of the sketch that I first showed you. In 1867, just after the Civil War, Young was elected the Episcopal Church's second bishop of Florida. At that time, he left New York to travel to Florida, where he took up residence in Fernandina. It was not called Fernandina Beach in those days. It picked up the beach as part of its name later on. The Florida economy at that time had been devastated by the Civil War. So Young inherited an episcopate in ruin. Florida homes and farms had been ransacked or burned. Churches, too, had suffered. In Jacksonville, the original wooden St. John's that Young had helped complete was burned by Union troops. St. Luke's, another Episcopal church, wooden church in Marietta, had been burned by Union troops. St. Mark's in Palatka, which I mentioned at the beginning, had been used as a barracks by Union troops, and notoriously they had cooked meat in its baptismal font. Other churches, too, had fallen into disrepair. With that as his starting point, Young's first years were, as he put it, mainly a struggle for life. But he persevered, traveling Florida by horseback, horse-drawn cart, steamboat, and sometimes in a small sailboat. He often slept outdoors. There were no convenience motels at that time. No mosquito controlled either. He organized missions. He visited families. He held services. He administered communion and conducted baptisms and confirmations. It was not until the end of his first decade as bishop that things began to change. At that point, the Gilded Age began flowering in America, bringing unprecedented growth and economic expansion. With those boom times, the outlook for Florida changed, arguably forever. As Young put it, with the return of general prosperity in 1877 came the beginning of a considerable immigration to our state. At that point, the seeds that Young had sown in the lean years began to bear fruit. Over the next 5 years, the missions that he had nurtured built some 25 wooden churches. By 1882, regular Episcopal services were being held in over 60 communities in Florida. The Episcopal Church had been firmly planted in Florida, and it was growing. Now, John Freeman Young, whom we're not looking at, again, that's Richard Upjohn, but John Freeman Young was an ardent proponent of the Oxford movement, which did many things. It changed the liturgy of the Episcopal Church and had influence in other denominations, but it revived traditions that preceded the split with Roman Catholicism. And it revived architectural principles from that time, which is to say, principles from the Middle Ages. Obviously, the Gothic revival did the same. Ecclesiology did the same. He was an ardent proponent of those movements, and he carried Upjohn's pattern book with him or plans based on the book. He had a personal interest in the construction of the churches, was often personally involved. Axe in hand, he helped clear the property for one of the churches over in Cocoa. So that was the extent of his personal involvement. The result is that scores of churches were built in the Richard Upjohn style during Young's episcopate and immediately following his episcopate. So now let's take our visual journey For that, I'm going to come over here and look at this with you. I'm going to operate several devices at a time. We'll see if I can. This is Trinity Church. This is a contemporary view, of course. It still stands in Manhattan, the church designed by Richard Upjohn, and where John Freeman Young worked for 7 years. One of the interesting things about this church is that its spire, sorry, wrong pointer, its spire was the highest point on the Manhattan skyline for many years, longer than the Empire State Building held that status. No building has been the tallest building on the Manhattan skyline longer than this church. We'll go now to the Florida churches. This is St. Margaret's in Hibernia on Fleming Island, a little north of Green Cove Springs. It was built as a family chapel in 1875. It was built by Margaret Seton Fleming of the Fleming family, famous Florida family, that owned most of Fleming Island from the second Spanish period all the way to World War II. The family produced a governor, a senator of Florida, and was very influential in its time. John Freeman Young was directly involved in the construction of this church. One of the things I'll point out is the bucolic environment, even to this day. This church is very much in the Florida back of beyond. There is a development taking place, unfortunately, somewhat behind it. When Phil and I first went, all these were dark woods here. The other thing I'll point out is the board and batten. I'll point out that these are traditionally arched, the classically curved arched lancets. And the last thing is that on most of the churches, the chimney has been removed. All the churches had chimneys. Most have had their chimneys removed when HVAC came about. But this one still has its chimney, and it's in a very unusual location in the center of the liturgical west wall. Let's go now to, just for fun, we're going to compare it to an older picture. It's quite small, but this is the same church from a slightly different angle. And here, one of the things I'm going to point out is the fence. All the churches had fences around them, and the reason for that is that there were free-ranging animals at that time, cattle, chicken, but above all, pigs. And pigs like to get under the churches because there they found cool dirt. And pigs love cool dirt, right? They perspire the way we do. They get hot the way we do. And so they would like to loll in the shade under the churches. That produced smells and noises that, of course, were not conducive to worship. So all the churches had fences. The next thing I'll point out is that this church still has its quarry windows. Do you remember I said that they often had a progression from the quarry type to the figurative type? Well, you can see, maybe not too well, but these are quarry windows. The last one you'll see is it looks a little lighter, right? And the reason for that is that one has been changed out. That one is now a figurative window. We'll see it from the inside in a minute. Here's the interior of the same church. You can see now the scissor trusses, right? You can see a Gothic arch here. And you can see that the walls are exposed wood. They are beaded paneling here. In the next photograph, you can see the lancet, the triple lancet altar window. And one of the interesting things about this window, well, there are quite a few things. This was the first window installed. It was made in 1880 by James Baker, a famous glass artisan in New York who did work for Richard Morris Hunt and Stanford White, the great architects. And he mixed his own formulas for glasses being double. His own formulas. Now, what we have here is a left panel that symbolizes night. You can see the moon at the top, the stars, and over here, this panel represents day. That's the sun at the top, daylight here, a sky. In the middle, they come together with stars and darkness up here and light here. Now, why is that? The reason for that is that Baker was trying to refer to the diurnal rhythms of frontier living on Fleming Island in frontier Florida. But it does more than that. The purpose is to connote Psalm 139 as well, which says, "Even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." So you see the coming together of darkness and light in the center panel. Now the next window is significant, again from the same church. Any cathedral in America would give its eye teeth to have this window. This window was made by David Maitland Armstrong. And what is significant about him is that he was the leading artisan for Tiffany Studios during its prime years. Now, he was a diplomat, a well-known figure in his time. He enjoyed independent wealth, so he was no mere laborer. But as an artisan, he was the leading producer of windows for Tiffany at that time. And he was able to create this window completely unfettered by any client preference. Normally, when these windows were created as memorials, the artisans would meet with the clients, get some idea of the themes that they wanted to express. He was completely unrestricted, and the reason for that is that he created this window as a memorial to his brother, who was a friend of the Flemings and had a cottage on Fleming Island, and indeed was the first treasurer for their chapel. So when his brother died and was buried just outside the chapel, Armstrong created this window in his memory. Now you can't see it, but at the bottom it says, "Fecit DMA," fecit being the Latin word F-E-C-I-T, and with the date that he created it. What does that mean? It means, I made this, or he made this, but it is a signature used, or that used to be used, by artisans to say, this wasn't done under my supervision, this wasn't done by my employees, I made this. And that makes this highly significant. This window is literally invaluable, and it's in the Florida back of beyond, which is very interesting. The next thing that we'll do, I do want to mention one other thing about this window, and you've already noticed it. This window anticipates modernism in its simplicity and its abstractness. I think that most or all of you know that the descending dove is a very common Christian symbol, used all the time in iconography. And it looks a little like this typically, right? With the bird's bill facing down, the dove is descending and the wings and the tail are in the air. That's the way it's been done for centuries. But here Armstrong is saying, we're going to do it differently. And instead he takes two dove wings and he clasps them together in this fashion. So it is abstract and modern in that sense. Now, we're going to go to our next church, which is St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs. And this church is, I'm going backwards, I think. Sorry, that's what happens when I hold it upside down. This church is magnificent for being one of the ones closest to water. It's right on the St. Johns River, and it was created by people who were engaged by John Freeman Young personally. The designer, the architect, was Charles Haight, a famous American Gothic revival architect who did buildings at Yale, quite a few buildings at Yale and other buildings. He was also the designer of Good Shepherd up the road in Maitland. So that's an interesting parallel between these two churches. It was built, again, John Freeman Young was personally involved in engaging the builder. It was built by James McGuire, who was a 6'6" former shipbuilder from New England, who thought he might be able to build buildings, and built this building. Went on to build the one in Maitland, he also built the Seminole Hotel, which many of you will recognize as having been the major hotel here in Winter Park in the early days. But he went on to even greater fame with a partner, Joseph McDonald. James McGuire, the builder of this church, became the builder for Henry Flagler and built all of the Flagler hotels. So the builder of this church built the Ponce de Leon, the Alcazar, the Breakers, the Royal Palm, all of the Flagler churches. Let's go to an early picture of this church. Here it's a little hard to see because of the quality of the photograph. It's from a different angle, but to the extent you can see, it, you will see that it's unchanged. This is the interior, and I'll point out that this is toward the elegant or stylized end of the Carpenter Gothic spectrum. And why do I say that? Well, because the interior walls have been plastered. That's one reason. Another is that it has these hammer beam arches, which are unusual and highly stylistic. You see that they aren't the classic scissor truss, which is simpler. There's a very stylized Canterbury cross up here. There is a sort of minimal rood screen here separating the nave from the altar, and most of the churches don't have that. I could go on, but this is at the high end of Carpenter Gothic. In the next photograph, and again, these were all taken by Phil, you can see two things. You can see one of the windows, in this case a quarry window, that has been tilted open in a horizontal central pin. They were all opened that way. You'll also see that down here there's another opening. You can't see the door, but it has a little door to it. That's a ventilation panel. Those could be opened to allow breezes to move through the churches during the warmer months, and they were used for that purpose. Don't let anybody tell you that these also doubled as fire exits. They didn't. If you had a fire in the front of the church, you'd get up and walk out the back. And if you had a fire in the back of the church, you'd get up and walk out through the sacristy, right? So these were not fire exits. I can't imagine how much time it would take even nimbler people of that era to get out through these. They were only for ventilation. This is the only church, the only Carpenter Gothic church in Florida where the windows and the ventilation panels can still be opened in the originally intended manner. Again, with HVAC, most of them have been sealed shut. At Good Shepherd in Maitland, they have ventilation panels. If you look when you go, you'll see them, but they're sealed shut. There's no purpose to opening them anymore. This next picture is the magnificent triple lancet at the altar. This was done by Edward Colgate. It is sometimes misidentified as being by Henry Sharp. It is not. It is a Colgate window. And it depicts faith, hope, and charity. The legendary Christian martyred saints from the 2nd century. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that charity, or love, as she's sometimes called, being the greatest of these, we know that from 1 Corinthians, is in the center. So even though they're always mentioned in the order of faith, hope, and charity, charity is in the center. Now, there's one thing I'd like to draw to your attention, and that is this symbolism right above charity. That, and I realize you can't see it very well, but that is a pelican on her nest with her young in front of her. She's pecking her breast, and there is blood dripping from her breast. Now, pelicans will do that. They will peck at their breasts, but it's to reflexively line the nest with feathers and down. But in medieval times, they didn't know that, and they thought that the mother pelican, who would do that to the point of causing bleeding on her chest, was actually using her blood to nourish her young. Now, you know where I'm going with this. That caused it to become a symbol at that time, adopted by the Christian church, and it is a Christian symbol because it connotes the the salvation provided, the nurturing provided, the spiritual nourishment provided by Jesus Christ to believers, and of course the spilling of blood in that connection. So that's where that symbol comes from. A lot of people are puzzled by that. The next photograph is sort of fun because this one puzzled the parish for a while. They weren't sure who it was. Well, we can say right off the bat that it's not Christ, because Christ would never be depicted in green. He would only be depicted in royal or heavenly blue or gold or red, but certainly not green. We also know that it's not Christ because of the halo. Halos have come and gone in iconography over the centuries. They were very popular in medieval times, which is why they were revived in these churches. And this halo is not appropriate for Christ. Christ would have a cruciform halo. There would be some implication of the cross in it, and here there is none. So we can rule that out. But we know this person has spiritual authority because of the halo. So we're starting to narrow it down. The words at the bottom are not a clue because they are the memorial words to the person for whom the window was in whose memory the window was donated. There are words further up, however, and they're a little hard to make out. So we're going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to tell you what they say. They say, Ecce Agnus Dei, which means, even for non-scholars of Latin, behold the Lamb of God. Those words, of course, were spoken by John the Baptist in the book of John, John 1:29. That gives us a pretty strong clue. 8 wild locusts, wore a coat of camel hair. He is a little suitably disheveled. You can't see that, but some of his locks of hair are a little out of place. But I think a bigger clue is that his right hand is raised in greeting, or almost in a prophetic or heralding manner. That's important because John was the then modern Elijah, heralding the arrival or announcing the arrival of Christ. So that's a confirmation. The scroll that he's holding in his left hand is too, because that symbolizes his prophetic nature. Now, if we need something more, let's go back to the green robe. Green symbolizes life, new life, right? Well, again, he's heralding a new life in Christ. So that's the significance of the green. It is a clincher. He's always depicted, there's the giveaway, he's always depicted in Christian iconography in green. I've never seen him not. So that's a pretty strong clue. And if we needed more, look at the background. That is the Jordan River, where he conducts his baptisms. So Phil and I were able to clear this up, hopefully for all time, for the good parishioners of St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs. Let's move on now to the third church, which is Grace in Port Orange, a little south of Jacksonville. Now you'll say right off the bat, where's the board and batten? Well, it was replaced. It was replaced with rough cut, dark shakes. But you can see that the windows are the straight edge type. They are lancets. Of course, it has a modern architectural shingle roof at this point. It has a bell coat instead of a tower. I had mentioned that sometimes you see that. Having the bell coat at the western end of the church was common in medieval times, and again, that's being re-expressed here in the Gothic revival. Notice these old trees to the left, ancient live oaks. Just kind of keep them in mind as we go to the next photograph. There they are peeking out. This photo's been cropped, but they're saplings when this was taken. But here you can see the original board and batten. It's a little hard to see. You can see it pretty well there. But the Trinity window here in triangular shape, the same. The entrance is the same. The door is the same. The bell coat is the same. Of course, the roof would have had the cypress or southern red cedar shingles that I mentioned earlier. You can see the lancet windows, but you can see underneath the lancet windows the ventilation panels. Those are covered over now. We'll look at the interior just for a second before going on. Here's the interior looking to the entrance. You can see that the windows are quarries. You can see that the doors, like the windows, either come to a arch. Our next church is a classic, and some of you who have seen it are going to be pleased to see it again. Does anybody recognize this church? It is St. George on Fort George Island. I know some of you have seen it. This is up not too far from Amelia Island, north of Jacksonville. It's in a fabulous location. All of this particular island is preserved now. It is steeped in Florida history, and we don't have time to go into that. But this church was designed by Robert Schuyler, the Fernandina architect, who donated his services to John Freeman Young and the diocese many times over, at least 6 or 7 times. Note the color scheme. It's modern, white, with trim in another color, often green. Note the metal roof, not original, but old. Let's go to an old photograph of this church. It's not very old, but you can see it's substantially the same. Even in this older photograph, something is missing, and that's the chimney. Remember I said that the chimneys were almost entirely removed. Almost all of them have been removed at this point. Here's the interior. Again, you have plaster walls. Something has already caught your attention, and that's the color of the ceiling. And you're wondering, was it originally blue or not? Now, there is medieval precedent for blue ceilings suggesting the sky and heaven, but all these churches had stained ceilings originally. So anytime you see the ceiling of a Carpenter Gothic church painted, it means it was done later. Incidentally, all of the churches that have painted their ceilings have never gone back. I mean, you can imagine they'd have to shut down the church, they'd have to sandblast. It would be very expensive and disruptive. So it's, in effect, an irreversible step. Notice that the windows are quarries. They come to straight edge points. Here is the altar window. Again, the name of this church is St. George. Here's the saint in action, depicted as he almost always is. And he is lancing the dragon. You can't see the dragon in great detail here, but its jaws are very menacing. And he's placing the lance, I believe, right in its mouth. He is wearing his customary colors, not the dragon, but St. George. And one thing that's a little different about this is that St. George is usually depicted on horseback, up on his horse lancing the dragon. And here he's standing. The last thing I'll point out is these medallions here. There are 6 of them, but there are 4 at the top and bottom. And those symbolically represent the evangelists, the 4 evangelists. The symbol for Matthew is a winged man. The symbol for Mark is a winged lion. And for Luke, it's a winged ox. And for John, it's an eagle. I realize you're not able to see the detail, but in our book, we can promise that you will. And by the way, because we have the lights on here, and because of the nature of the projection, all these are a little washed out. They're not doing credit to Phil's photographs. They're resplendent in the book. The next thing that we'll go to is another window, the last of the pictures of this church. This is a contemporary Alleluia window. It has many features to it that go way back. One of them is the classic descending dove. You'll recall that I described that. Of course, it says Alleluia in the middle. This window was done in 2005 by Truett George, who was a nationally renowned stained glass artisan. He was, for a while, the president of the Stained Glass Artists Association of America. But he included an interesting detail. This window was given as a memorial to Cameron Gallion, who died. He was a parishioner. He was 14 when he died. Cameron was an avid surfer. And you can see this detail here showing Cameron catching his last wave. So that's, if you go to the church, that's up near the altar on the left. The next church is the Church of Our Savior in Mandarin. This one has a fabulous history to it. I am showing you an old version of it for a reason. We'll get to that in a minute. This church was sponsored by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was one of the most famous people in the world at the time. She sold what was then the best-selling novel of all time, one that certainly played a role in pushing the nation into civil war. When President Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he is reputed, according to Stowe family legend, to have said, "So you're the little woman," she was very short, she wasn't even 5 feet tall, "You're the little woman who started this great war." Of course, he was very tall, so you can imagine the encounter. Harriet Beecher Stowe was wealthy after her book had been out for a while, and she bought a cottage in Mandarin, Florida. Mandarin's a little south of Jacksonville on the St. Johns River. Now, you can see here some stick work on the outside of the building, and you're already seeing some differences from the classic Carpenter Gothic form. What are those? The roof is not as steeply pitched, and you're seeing these stained planks, like this one here and this one here. And so you're wondering, what's going on here? And what's with the rectangular window, too? And the answer is that this is more in the stick style, which was a hybrid between the Carpenter Gothic style and the Queen Anne style. Here is the Stowe cottage in Mandarin. Again, you can't see it too well because of the size of the picture, but Harriet Beecher Stowe is seated here wearing, as she almost always did, a black dress from ankle to wrist. Her husband, Calvin, who is a noted theologian and professor, is standing. He had enormous white whiskers. You might be able to make those out. If you see a blob of white there, that's his beard and his hair. Their daughters are flanking them. You can see there's a live oak that they loved so much that they left it in place, and they built their porch around it. They almost lived on the porch when they came to Mandarin. They were there every winter for the rest of their lives. The next church is interesting because it's the architectural twin of the church that was built by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And why is that? This church was built by William Durant, who was the builder of the so-called Great Camps in the Adirondacks. The Great Camps were built for the Astors, the Morgans, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, and Durant built this church for them on an island on Raquette Lake, just off of some of their properties. And they would go by boat to this island, which doesn't have any buildings then or today, in order to worship. This church was designed by a famous architectural firm, the firm of J. Cleveland Cady. Durant, the builder of the church, was a friend of neighbors of the Stowes in Mandarin. He came to Mandarin on a visit. He sat at the dinner table with the Stowes and the Cranes, the neighbors of the Stowes, and heard about their plans to build a church in Mandarin. And he said, "Well, I just built one." And he just had. In 1880, it was this one. And he offered them the plans. He sent them the plans. Harriet Beecher Stowe gave them to the firm of Ellis and McClure in Jacksonville, and all they did was enlarge them slightly. And what that means is that the church in Mandarin and the church up on this remote island, and it stands today, it looks like this today, in the Adirondacks, are architectural twins, which is significant for another reason that we'll get to in a moment. When the Stowes died, the congregation memorialized them with a window. They raised $1,000, which was a lot at the time, and they went to 5 different firms in New York and were terribly disappointed when all the firms said that it would cost more than what they had. The last firm they went to was the most expensive of all, Tiffany Studios, so they were very downcast when they went. But they were stunned to learn that Louis Comfort Tiffany was a great Harriet Beecher Stowe fan, and he effectively donated this window. He said, I'll take what you're offering, but never mind the rest. And so he was largely a contributor to this window. This is hard to make out, but it shows 2 live oaks. I like to imagine that the one in the foreground, the larger one, is Harriet Beecher Stowe, because she was more famous, and the other in the background is her supporting husband. This is the St. Johns River. They are trailing live moss. The artisans up in New York City at Tiffany had to requisition Spanish moss. It was actually shipped up to them. They didn't know what it was. It had to be shown to them, and they worked from it as best they could. They hung it up in the studio. This was on display in New York City for a month, and there was a steady stream of people going by it for the entire month. And then it was crated and shipped to Florida, where it was installed in the church. And for many years, decades, tourists, even from Europe and other parts of the world, would stop their cars and unfurl maps on their knees and try to figure out how to find this church so that they could see this window. It vied with Florida's tourist attractions at the time for popularity, so much so that the church, which struggled at times after the citrus freezes in the 1800s, was able to pay all of its expenses of upkeep just from the coins that were dropped in a box by all the tourists that stopped to see this window. But the end of the story is a little sad, because Hurricane Dora in 1964 went straight to Jacksonville and straight to this church. And it toppled a massive hickory tree, which fell through the church like a sword through a gingerbread house. It destroyed it. And it destroyed the Tiffany window. The Tiffany window was shattered to tiny pieces. Phil and I have had the privilege of seeing some of those pieces, which have been preserved in a small museum in Mandarin, but it was deemed impossible to reconstitute them into the original window. However, incredibly, the other windows were intact, all the other windows, as were many other things from the church, and they were salvaged, and we'll see what was done with them in a minute. Here is the altar window from the original church. And as you can see, it exists today because Phil photographed it. And I just want to spend a moment on it because, as you can see, it shows a young girl presenting her little brother to Christ. And it says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me." Now, we know that's a biblical story. We might not think much further about it. But this is the so-called Denham window. And it's a memorial to Rolf and Emma Denham. They died when they were 7 and 5. They died simultaneously, possibly in an accident. But I did a little digging around, and I was able to find out that they died in the summer. And I also was able to find that Jacksonville was struck with a pretty severe smallpox epidemic that very summer. They could have died of malaria, they could have died of yellow fever, but I think the best theory is that they probably died together of smallpox. So where is this window today? The answer is that when the parish replaced their 1800s church, when it was destroyed, with a church that they built within a year. They built one in 1965, and they built a side chapel that was designed to evoke the original church. This is that side chapel. So as much as possible, it looks like the original church. And you can see that sort of in the angle of the roof. You can see it in the Denham window at the altar. The lectern, the prayer desk, the altar are all original, carried over. The baptismal font as well, the baptismal font came from England. So it was very much worth keeping. 8 of these pews are from the original church too, and you can tell them apart only because their finishes are a little more satiny. They've been buffed by the backsides of parishioners for a good bit longer than the newer ones, and that's how you can tell them apart. Otherwise, all the windows are from the original church. The next church is an interesting one because it's Kidane Miret. To give you the full name of it, it is the Kidane Miret Ethiopian Orthodox Tuwedo Church. And you may wonder, well, I thought we were talking about Episcopal churches. This was an Episcopal church when it was first built. And when it was first built, it was far from here. It was built in 1885 in Huntington, which is very near Crescent City, a good bit south of where it is today. It was then called All Saints. It was built by a woman named Catherine Huntington. In 1943, it was completely dismantled. Every board was numbered. It was dismantled. It was put on carts. It was taken to the St. Johns River at Willaca. And there it was put on a barge or barges and floated up to Jacksonville. There it was unloaded. It was taken to Gilmore and Soltis Streets, where it was reconstituted for an Episcopal mission, which was named St. Stephen's. In 1971, they put in I-10 in Jacksonville, disrupted the neighborhood, attendance fell off, and so it was moved again. It was moved to Normandy Boulevard in Jacksonville for what became Nativity Church, again an Episcopal church. But eventually attendance there too waned. The congregation could no longer keep up the church, and so they sold it to the Ethiopian Americans who have it to this day, and they own it and conduct their services in it. Phil and I had the pleasure of going and being there for one of those. Here's an early photo of the church. When it was still in Huntington, you can see it had a bell tower at that time. It was considered a very fine church at that time. The bell tower at some point deteriorated, and they had to dismantle it and no longer use it. Here is a shot of the interior, and you can see that the current owners have a drop-down screen. They also have banners, and they have a couple of posters. But apart from that, it is substantially, even down to the lights, the way it was when it was built. And you can see the priest there to the side. The last thing I'll show you is a shot that Phil took of the trusses and the ceiling boards. We put both our flashlights on the boards, and we thought we could make out dim numerals, left there after all these years from when they dismantled the church. The next church is our next to last, and it is today called the Beaches Museum Chapel because it's at the Beaches Museum in Jacksonville Beach, but it was built in 1887 as St. Paul's by the Sea. It was designed by Robert Schuyler, whom I mentioned earlier. It was substantially restored in the 1920s, and in 2012, the tower was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt identically to the original, no change at all. I'll show you an early photo of the church. This is before an extension of the nave in 1955. You can see it's a good bit shorter. Otherwise, it's much the same, and you can see the tower peeking over the roof there. That's the original tower, of course. The next thing we'll look at is Phil's photograph of the tower. Here we'll revert to Christian symbolism for just a moment. You'll see that the tower is square at the bottom, but it graduates into an octagon. And there are reasons for that. Nothing is accidental in Christian architecture, particularly from this era. Everything has a meaning. And in Christian symbolism, the earth is represented by the square with 4 corners, as they thought the earth had at one time. Whereas the circle, with its perfection, was considered the symbol of heaven. The octagon is considered the meeting of the two, the intersection between earth and heaven. So here, as you progress heavenward, you progress toward the circle. And this symbolizes a Christian's spiritual journey on earth, the sanctification process, that you start from the earth, but you are moving in this direction. So again, everything has a meaning. Now the next thing is a puzzlement to many people who see it. This is the facade of the church. You can see the tower on the left, but a lot of people wonder about this. What's going on here? What is the Star of David doing on a Christian church? And the answer is that this is a hexagram. At least when in the Christian environment, it is referred to as such. It is 2 interlocking triangles. The triangle, as long as it has equal sides, is a symbol of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So 2 interlocking triangles. This symbol is an ancient symbol, but it was used in churches, in Christian churches, before it was used in synagogues. This symbol was not identified with Judaism until it was adopted in 1893 by the modern Zionist movement. So today, most of us were born after 1893. We simply see this as the Star of David. But when this church was built, it didn't have that association at all. This was still primarily a Christian symbol. The next thing that we'll look at is the last of the photographs from this church. It's the interior view, and here you can see that the windows are rectangular. That's a departure from the Carpenter Gothic. We now know that. But if we go back, we can see that there's a good example. You see the window on the right? It's rectangular, but above it, there's a peak for Gothic effect. Okay, so from a distance, it does have the Gothic effect, but they either couldn't afford that, which is probably the case, because they filled these windows with clear glass. And that was unusual. They clearly intended that they would be replaced by stained glass over time, memorial windows, but that didn't happen because Jacksonville Beach had a series of misfortunes that I won't get into, but this church fell into disuse. It even had piles of sand forming it at one time till it was rescued in the 1920s. But because the windows were clear, according to church legend, that led to problems because it was right on the beach originally. It's been moved 4 times, but it was originally right on the beach. And at that time, the clothing that beachgoers wore was undergoing an incredible transformation. Until then, women had worn clothes, often black, dresses in effect, from the wrist to the ankle, whenever they went to bathe in public places. And they often didn't do that. But in a very short time, just a shockingly short time, their arms were exposed and most of their legs, and even some of their shoulders. And it is said, according to church legend, that led to some head swiveling in the pews on Sunday morning as people would head to the beach outside the windows. And indeed, they changed the windows and they frosted them, and that's apparently the reason for their having done that. The last church that we're going to be taking a peek at is this one, and today this is called San Marco Preservation Hall, but it was built in 1988 as St. Paul's Church in the South Arlington district or neighborhood of Jacksonville. Now, Fletcher Park, where it's located today, is on Atlantic Boulevard. And there the church is deconsecrated, but it serves a purpose. Visitors can walk into it, and it can be rented for private occasions, and it frequently is. Weddings, meetings, other gatherings. We'll see the interior in a minute. I'll show you an early photo since we've been doing that. This is the same church. The entrance is a little bit different. You can see the bellcote again near the west wall. When I say west wall, I'm not using the compass. There's a liturgical east, west, north, south. The altar is always east, and the rear wall is always west, and that was indeed the configuration for all churches in medieval times, and most of these, but not all of them. You can see the board and batten quite easily, and you can also see that these were the wooden shingles. The next photograph I'll show you is the church being loaded in the 1950s onto a barge. This church, and this often happens, was outgrown by its parish. What did they do? They built a new church. They kept this one for a Sunday school for a while and for classes, and then finally they donated it when they needed to build larger classrooms. They donated it to the Museum of Arts and Sciences, and it was floated by barge to that museum in downtown Jacksonville. By the way, at the Museum of Arts and Sciences, it was used as a children's theater for many years. And to this day, there are elderly residents or at least residents of my age, in Jacksonville who can recall having been taken there as children to see theatrical productions. Here it is today. On the interior, you can see the pews have been replaced by very stylish ladder-back chairs, but you can see the original walls, the original ceiling trusses. The ceiling has not been painted and never has been. The original door is there, and you can see that the windows have the classic Gothic arch. The last two pictures we'll look at are inside details, an original door. Phil and I think that the hardware is original on this door. And then the stage, you can see they built up they used in effect the elevated area that was previously the chancel for the stage for the theater. And you can see the inlaid cross in the panel work. That's the only remaining cross in the building. It did have crosses on the top of the roof, but in a what we could call a gentle defrocking, those crosses were removed when the church passed onto property that was publicly funded, the museum and this park, as a concession to the separation of church and state. That's the last of the churches that we'll show you, and I'll bring our presentation to a close now by leaving you with the thought that these churches are worthy of our attention, as I hope we've seen from several perspectives: historical, architectural, cultural, spiritual. They're now entering their third century of existence, despite the fact that they're made of untreated wood, and they're still standing against the odds in a state like Florida, which, as you know, is occasioned by much lightning and hurricanes and flooding and so forth. In effect, they're silent witnesses to the faith of the pioneers who raised them. They're an indispensable part of our heritage. They have earned our continuing protection and preservation. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Phil will join me for a moment just in case you have any questions that we can answer. Yes?
Going back to the church in Valencia, were you able to determine what the actual wood was? I'm assuming it was the hardwood that constituted the beams, the general structure of the church.
Yes, sir. It is made of longleaf pine, which we have probably only yards away, very common in Winter Park. It was abundant in North Florida. It was abundant throughout Florida, but particularly North and Central Florida. And it was used in all these churches. Now, some people will tell you, for example, in All Saints at Enterprise, again on the north shore of Lake Monroe, that there are some cypress and red cedar accents on the interior, and they are right. But all these churches were built of longleaf pine, which goes by other names, yellow pine, southern yellow pine, dade pine. And as you know, because you alluded to it, that particular pine is densely resinous, and that resin hardens over time. You cannot drive a nail conventionally. You cannot drive a nail into this wood. And when termites go after it, which they have done on some of these churches, they've quickly given up because even their mandibles are not up to the task. I mean, this wood was chosen to last. Another thing that many of you probably know is that virgin longleaf pine that has grown for a long period of time will have a very large heartwood core to it. That's the wood that they used. They did not use the outer part of the wood, the sapwood, the flesh of the tree. The heartwood acts as a spine of the tree. The sapwood acts as the flesh of the tree and carries the nutrients up and down. The heartwood is dead. Those cells are dead, but they're incredibly hard. They did not use the sapwood because there were no treatments of wood in those days, no chemical or pressure treatments. They used only the interior, and again, they had a lot of that because they were dealing with virgin pine that had a tremendous, that ratio changes. As the tree gets older, the sapwood is smaller and smaller on the perimeter. The heartwood or skeleton gets bigger and bigger. So they had plenty to work with. Yes, ma'am.
What was the typical size of a congregation for one of these churches? And where is the closest one to us in Winter Park that we can see?
Good questions. They often would start with as few as 7 families. And as you know, there was a distinction drawn back then between the registered members and the families represented by those members, and they would sometimes distinguish that. I would say that it ranged from 20 people, as few as 20, to as many as 80 at most of these churches, but that was quite a bit. In Ocala at the time grew so fast that they outgrew their church almost immediately. And remember that church was very, very small. So it varied, but I think that's the best answer, anywhere from 20 to about 80. And of course, all these churches have been outgrown at one time or another, although the one in Willaca on a good Sunday has about 12 today. So it's kind of back to where it began. Now, you asked about the nearest one. The nearest one is actually, it's a little bit of a stretch, but within walking distance. And it's Church of the Good Shepherd in Maitland. As you take Lake Avenue toward Eatonville, turning left from 1792, leaving from here, turning left on Lake, where, what's there? The Copper Rocket, I guess, is there. And you will bump over railroad tracks almost immediately. Those have been there a long time. And you will come to the church on your right. Now, you'll see the more modern sanctuary designed by Nils Schweitzer. But if you look to the left of it, you have to take away in your mind's eye an ambulatory, covered walkway, wheelchair ramp. But there it is. I mean, it is largely unchanged. And if you get the chance to go inside that church, do not miss the chance, because it's completely unchanged from the pioneer era. These churches are like time capsules. I mean, they come straight to us from a time when Florida was the last frontier on the east coast of the United States. It was, South Florida was uncharted. Miami didn't exist. Miami would be on anybody's list of the top 50 cities of the world today, but if you formed that list back during this era, say 1850, Miami wouldn't be on the list. Amsterdam would be on it. New York would be on it. Rome would be on it. But there'd be a missing city. It would be Miami, which takes me to another point, which is that the story of Florida's development. Everybody says, "Oh gosh, there's so much development in Florida," and indeed, for this Floridian's money, there is. But if you fly over Florida, as I'm sure everybody has, you'll see lots and lots of green space. So the true story of Florida's development is not the extent to which it's been developed, but the speed with which it was developed. When you consider that Miami wasn't even a trading post in 1850 and became one only after that, and of course became what it is today. Yes.
You may have said this and I missed it, but are most of the churches still active as churches? Are they protected by the churches, or did some of them rely on other funds for historic preservation?
That's another great question, and it reminds me, as I have been already, that this format isn't, all this is covered in the book, of course, but that's the kind of thing I should have mentioned. The answer is that they fall into different categories. Some have never had a larger church added to them. The one in Willaca is a good example. And their attendance has ebbed and fallen over the years. Others have, like Grace in Port Orange, have had very nice modern churches built across the street or nearby. And they use the older church as a chapel. St. Luke's in Courtenay on Merritt Island, another good example of that. Still others have been extended and added on to. St. Barnabas in DeLand is beautiful, but it's been added on to such a great deal, such a great extent, that with great difficulty, Phil and I felt that it didn't quite make the cut. I hate to put it that way, for extended treatment in our book. Likewise, the beautiful church in Cocoa, where Phil attended as a child. That church began as a Carpenter Gothic. It was the one where John Freeman Young actually took a broadaxe to the woods himself and helped clear the property. But at one point they added stucco and a kind of a Mediterranean revival to the exterior. Inside, it's all the original wood and very beautiful, but for that reason we decided that we couldn't include it either. So the answer is that it varies. And the last category is when they donate them to another body, as occurred with the Ethiopian American Church, or they donate them to a museum. Beaches Museum was one. Beaches Museum Chapel was one that we saw. Any other questions?
Are there any at risk of being torn down or not being preserved?
That's a tough question. One was torn down to make room for the Hart Expressway in Jacksonville. A couple have been demolished by storms. Some were torn down so early they were on private property.
But I mean, as the one that's currently at risk.
There's none currently at risk. They're all at risk in the sense that a hurricane could undo any of them. It's interesting because one we saw, the second one, St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs, during the massive flooding after Hurricane Irma of the St. Johns River. The St. Johns came up. You saw how close in the photograph the river was. It came up and surrounded the church, and the church looked like a Slovenian castle in a lake. But it seems that the piers were set at their level presciently because the water came up to the floorboards, and you could hear it lapping the floorboards from inside and outside, but then the water receded. Very little damage done in the end. So they were built to last, but no church is currently under threat of demolition. They are all, to some extent, threatened by the world in which they now find themselves. At one point in the book, I say that it's as if these churches were lifted up, like Dorothy and her house, from Kansas. And now they awaken in Oz, and they're rubbing their eyes, and they're seeing the modern megachurch, which might seat 1,000 people. It's going to have, extensive audiovisual technology. It's going to have a church. It's going to have a school and offices attached. It'll have a porte cochere. It'll have all kinds of. They'll serve coffee in it. They'll have restrooms. None of these churches had restrooms. To the Victorian mind, to have conjoined the needs of the flesh with any kind of thought for the spirit would have been, unthinkable. I mean, if there was a call of nature, you dealt with it before or after church, but certainly not during or anywhere near. So none of them, to this day, only one attached bathrooms, and they're very, very small. Any other questions? You've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much. Thank you.